Inside ADX Florence Supermax, the Real Alcatraz of the Rockies, the sound of nothingness. The cell door slammed shut with a metallic echo that seemed to last forever. Inside, a man once known as the most dangerous criminal in America sat alone, trapped in a room no bigger than a bathroom. No windows, no sunlight, just four walls of concrete, and a steel door that would not open again until 23 hours had passed. ADX Florence, hidden deep in the Colorado Rockies, is called the Alcatraz of the Rockies for a reason. Some of the most feared men in the world live and slowly break inside these walls. In here, there are no second chances. The strong survive by keeping their minds sharp, but the weak, they crumble into madness. And on one shocking night, an inmate found a way to make even this escape-proof prison tremble. Guards rushed through the long, echoing corridors. Alarms blared. An officer shouted, "How did he do it?" What happened inside that cell would force the prison to rethink everything it thought was unbreakable. But how did we get here? And what really makes this place so feared? The prison built to end all escapes. The story begins in 1994. America had already seen prisons like Alcatraz, Leavenworth, and Marion, but each one eventually cracked. Inmates escaped, riots broke out, or guards lost control. The government needed something stronger, something final. That's when they built ADX Florence in Colorado, a fortress buried in the desert mountains. Every detail was designed for control. Each cell is a concrete box with a small slot for food, a sink, a toilet, and a bed carved from stone. Prisoners spend 23 hours a day locked inside, with just 1 hour in a small cage outside, still surrounded by walls too high to see beyond. At first, life here was silent. The first prisoners sent to ADX were the worst of the worst. Terrorists, cartel leaders, gang bosses, and spies. They had escaped other prisons before. But in Florence, escape wasn't just impossible, it was unthinkable. Or at least, that's what the officials believed. Because in 1998, something happened that would shake ADX to its core. The first cracks in the fortress. It started small. A guard on the night shift noticed movement on a camera feed. At first, he thought it was nothing, a shadow passing across the narrow concrete recreation pen. But when he zoomed in, his blood ran cold. One of the inmates had figured out how to dismantle part of the light fixture inside his cell. Piece by piece, he had sharpened it into a weapon. For months, he had been waiting, hiding, pretending to be broken by isolation. But on that night, he made his move. The guard called for backup, but it was too late. A group of officers rushing past the control gate didn't realize they were walking straight into a trap. The inmate lunged forward, weapon in hand, his face twisted with rage. The silence of ADX Florence shattered. Blood on the concrete. The inmate's weapon sliced through the air as guards tried to wrestle him down. In a place where prisoners were supposed to be controlled at every second, this was chaos. Alarms blared, red lights flashed across the corridor, and the steel doors around the unit locked tight. It took 6 officers to finally pin the man to the ground. His face was pressed against the cold concrete, his weapon clattering to the side. He screamed that he would never be broken by Florence. His words echoed down the halls like a challenge to the prison itself. After the attack, he was dragged into deeper isolation. Even fewer hours outside the cell. Even less human contact. ADX had designed this punishment for men exactly like him, those who refused to submit. But here's the twist. This wasn't the first time ADX had underestimated the minds of its inmates. For while some prisoners lost themselves to madness and total silence, others spent their 23 locked hours planning and waiting. The madness inside the walls. Day after day, men in ADX Florence sat alone with nothing but their thoughts. For some, the silence was worse than any beating. They whispered to themselves, shouted into the walls, or tapped secret codes on the pipes, trying to reach other prisoners. One man believed the prison staff were poisoning his food. He stopped eating. Another scratched drawings into the floor with his fingernails until his hands bled. In ADX, isolation wasn't just a punishment. It was a weapon that could turn even the hardest men insane. And then in 2005, the silence broke again, this time in the most horrifying way. A guard making his rounds stopped at a cell door. He peered inside and froze. The prisoner had found a way to shatter the ultimate rule of ADX. Even in total isolation, he had carried out a brutal act of violence without ever leaving his cell. Violence without freedom. When the guard opened the steel slot, he saw blood smeared across the cell walls. Inside, the prisoner sat cross-legged on the floor, staring blankly. At his feet lay another inmate, lifeless. But wait, how was that possible? In ADX Florence, prisoners are supposed to be completely alone. The truth was darker. During a rare transfer, 2 men had been accidentally placed together in a holding cell. One of them didn't live to see the next morning. The news spread fast across the prison. If violence had happened even here, in the so-called escape-proof fortress, then nowhere was safe. Guard became stricter, movements even tighter, and inmates were pushed deeper into silence. For a short while, the halls returned to their eerie, controlled calm. But calm never lasts long in ADX Florence. The letter that shouldn't exist. Weeks later, a male officer found something strange. A letter, smuggled out of the prison, had reached the hands of a journalist. It described life inside ADX. The 23-hour lockdown, the suffocating silence, the way men were buried alive in concrete. Officials were stunned. No prisoner was supposed to have outside contact, except through strict screening. So, how did this letter make it out? Investigators dug deeper, and what they uncovered shook the prison again. There was an underground communication network. Secret codes hidden in legal mail. Tiny messages passed through cracks. Even guards suspected of helping for cash. Florence was supposed to be unbreakable, but the cracks in the fortress were growing wider. And soon, one of the most infamous inmates in American history would test those cracks like never before. The cartel boss in a concrete cage. They called him El Patron of the Rockies. He was a powerful cartel leader shipped to ADX after authorities realized no other prison could contain him. In Mexico, he had armies. In regular prisons, he had bribed guards. But here, in Florence, he was just another number. Each morning, his food came through a slot. Each night, his cell lights dimmed at exactly the same hour. Guards thought the silence had broken him. But behind those stone-gray walls, the man was plotting. Unlike others who cracked under the pressure, he thrived on patience. He spent hours doing push-ups on the floor, then mapped out escape routes in his head. His only goal, find a way to reach the outside world again. For months, nothing happened. The prison was calm. The bosses in Washington congratulated themselves, calling ADX the end of the line. But then one evening, a guard noticed something odd during rounds. The slot in the cartel boss's door had been tampered with. When they searched his cell, they found something terrifying. Pieces of metal sharpened into blades, hidden inside the concrete bed frame. The fortress was not as unbreakable as everyone thought. When the Rockies shook, the discovery triggered a lockdown. Dozens of guards stormed the cell block, moving prisoners one by one. The halls echoed with the thunder of boots, the slam of steel doors, and the shouts of officers yelling, "Lock it down." For a few hours, the prison was silent again. But silence at ADX is never peace. It's a warning, because just 2 days later, an officer escorting a different inmate was attacked so suddenly that his radio clattered to the ground before he could call for help. The Rockies trembled that night, not from an earthquake, but from a fear that even America's most secure prison was slowly losing control. Lockdown nation. After the attack on the officer, ADX Florence went into what they called full lockdown. Every door was sealed. Every movement froze. Even the tiny 1-hour exercise breaks were canceled. Inmates were locked inside their cells 24 hours a day. For the staff, this was supposed to be control. They tightened security, doubled surveillance, and checked every cell for weapons or contraband. On paper, the fortress was stronger than ever, but the truth was different. The prison silence had turned into a boiling pressure cooker. Inmates who had already been isolated for years were now pushed further into madness. Some screamed through the vents all night. Others banged on the steel doors until their hands bled. Guard began whispering that they were working in a ticking time bomb. They could feel it, The walls might be concrete, but the tension inside was about to explode. And explode it did. One morning, as guards escorted a notorious gang leader to the corridor, he suddenly turned his head and spat out a phrase in Spanish that chilled them. Hoy comienza la guerra. Today the war begins. Within hours, Florence's underground network lit up and chaos swept through the blocks. The riot that shouldn't have happened. It started with a single bang, then another, then dozens more. Prisoners across different units began kicking and slamming their doors in unison. The sound roared through the concrete halls like thunder. Guards rushed to contain it. But ADX Florence had never seen anything like this before. Men who were supposed to be silent, buried, and broken were now communicating, chanting, shouting, demanding. Some set fires using scraps of clothing. Others flooded their cells by clogging toilets. The Alcatraz of the Rockies was supposed to be escape-proof, riot-proof, chaos-proof. But here it was, the unthinkable happening in real time. For the first time since its creation, ADX Florence felt like it was slipping out of the government's grip, crushing the uprising. When the riot broke out, alarms screamed across the prison, echoing to the mountains of Colorado. ADX Florence went into its highest emergency state. Dozens of heavily armed response teams, dressed in black riot gear and carrying shields, flooded the blocks. Tear gas canisters hissed, filling the air with a sharp chemical sting. Officers stormed door after door, dragging inmates out and shackling them face down on the concrete floors. The fires were extinguished. The shouting dulled into coughs and silence. By sunrise, the uprising was over. The Alcatraz of the Rockies looked calm again. The officials proudly announced that ADX had maintained total control. But behind those stone-gray walls, cracks were widening. The prisoners hadn't won, but they had sent a message. Even buried alive, they still had power. The ghosts in the system. Weeks later, as Florence slowly returned to routine, something strange happened. A guard on night duty swore he heard tapping sounds echoing through the ventilation shafts. Not once, not twice, but in a rhythm, almost like Morse code. At first, supervisors brushed it off as paranoia. But then, intercepted mail hinted at secret instructions being passed around. Prisoners who were supposed to be locked in silence were still finding ways to communicate, through pipes, through vents, through the walls themselves. ADX was supposed to be escape-proof, riot-proof, silence-proof. But if men could still organize from inside their concrete tombs, then was the prison really unbreakable? And one day, those whispers turned into something bigger, something that would force the entire world to pay attention to what was happening inside the Rockies. Whispers to the outside. For years, ADX Florence kept its reputation as America's most secure and silent prison. Officials told the public that nothing happened inside. No riots, no violence, no weakness. To the outside world, it was a concrete tomb where the worst men simply disappeared. But slowly, information began to leak. Journalists started receiving letters, smuggled descriptions of 23-hour lockdowns, of men going blind from lack of sunlight, of screams echoing through the halls at night. Human rights lawyers filed lawsuits, accusing ADX of cruel and unusual punishment. One report described it as a place where people were buried alive. Suddenly, the fortress that was meant to be invisible was being pulled into the spotlight. For a moment, it seemed like the world might finally see the truth. The government scrambled to tighten mail screening, to control the narrative. On the surface, the storm passed. The prison returned to its routine silence. But silence in Florence never means safety. The day the world found out. Then, one day, the silence broke in a way no one expected. A massive media investigation uncovered proof of everything. Secret letters, testimony from former guards, and even recordings smuggled out of the prison. The reports called ADX Florence the Real Alcatraz of the Rockies, not because it was unbreakable, but because it was breaking the men inside. For the first time, the American public was forced to face the reality of what went on behind those stone walls. Families of inmates demanded answers. Activists protested outside. Politicians were pressed with questions they couldn't easily dismiss. And deep inside ADX, the prisoners who had caused the cracks smiled in the shadows. Their message had finally reached the world. But with more eyes now on the fortress than ever before, the prison's darkest chapter was still yet to come. Buried in silence, inside ADX, life seemed to return to its usual rhythm. The sound of steel doors slamming shut, the echo of footsteps in empty corridors, the faint buzz of fluorescent lights. These were the daily soundtrack. Guards carried out their shifts. Prisoners sat in their concrete boxes. To outsiders, it looked as though the media storm had passed. The government reassured the public that everything was under control. But behind the walls, the silence was suffocating. Some inmates stopped speaking altogether. Others paced endlessly, their minds unraveling in the endless loop of isolation. And then came the darkest discovery, the suicide wing. One morning, a guard making his rounds found a cell unusually quiet, even for ADX. Inside, an inmate lay motionless, his bedsheet twisted into a noose around his neck. Despite 24-hour surveillance and suicide-proof cells, he was gone. The shock spread like wildfire through the prison. If men could take their own lives in a place designed to control every breath, then ADX wasn't just a prison. It was a machine grinding people down until death was the only escape. Over the years, more cases surfaced. Some prisoners slashed their wrists with hidden shards. Others banged their heads against the walls until they couldn't anymore. Each death was quickly covered up, recorded as incidents, and filed away. But the truth was impossible to hide forever. Lawyers, families, and even former staff began speaking out. The Alcatraz of the Rockies wasn't just about keeping criminals in. It was about slowly destroying the human mind. And soon, one case would push ADX into the courtroom of the entire world. The courtroom battle. Families of inmates, backed by human rights lawyers, filed lawsuit after lawsuit against ADX Florence. They argued that locking men away in 23-hour isolation for years was not just punishment, it was torture. In court, witnesses described the silence, the madness, the suicides. One former guard admitted that he had seen prisoners lose their minds right in front of him. Another testified about men who hadn't touched grass or felt fresh air in decades. The U.S. government fought back, saying ADX was necessary to protect the public from the most dangerous criminals alive. Terrorists, cartel bosses, and killers. Men who could not be trusted in any other prison. The courtroom was divided. Was ADX justice or cruelty? For a moment, it looked like the lawsuits might actually force change. But then, a bombshell piece of evidence surfaced. The hidden files. A leaked set of internal reports revealed something shocking. ADX officials had long known about the psychological damage their prison was causing. They had documented the screams at night, the self-harm, even the suicides, but buried the files deep in locked cabinets. Worse still, the documents revealed a chilling nickname among staff. The Cleaner. This was the unofficial term for the protocol used to cover up incidents before they reached the public eye. The revelation hit headlines across the United States, the UK, and Canada. For the first time, ADX Florence wasn't being spoken of as America's strongest fortress, but as its darkest secret. And with the world now watching, the question grew louder. Could ADX Florence truly survive the weight of its own silence? When the world looked in, the leak sparked a storm bigger than anyone inside ADX Florence had ever imagined. News networks ran exposés night after night. Families of prisoners stood outside the gates with signs reading, "No one deserves this," and "Buried alive is not justice." Politicians in Washington were forced to respond. Some argued that ADX was essential. Housing terrorists, mass killers, and cartel lords would destroy lives if given the chance. Others said America's reputation was at stake. That Florence had become a symbol of cruelty rather than justice. International human rights groups joined the fight. Amnesty International released a report calling ADX inhuman and degrading. The United Nations even stepped in, warning that long-term solitary confinement could amount to torture under international law. For the first time since it was built, there were whispers in Congress about whether ADX Florence, the Alcatraz of the Rockies, should even exist. The call for closure. Then came the shocking headline that shook the Rockies. Several senators openly proposed shutting ADX down. They called it a national shame, arguing that the prison was doing more damage to minds than it was delivering justice. The debate raged. Could America really close the fortress designed to end all escapes? What would happen to the men inside, terrorists, gang leaders, and masterminds who had proven they could not be contained anywhere else? The public was divided. Some cried out for justice for the inmates. Others demanded the prison stay open forever, no matter the cost. But as the world argued, deep inside ADX Florence, the prisoners heard the news too. And for them, it meant only one thing. If the fortress was weakening, maybe, just maybe, freedom was closer than ever. The hope inside the walls. Life inside ADX was as it had always been. Doors slamming, trays sliding through steel slots, men pacing tiny concrete boxes. But this time, something felt different. The news had seeped in through legal mail, scraps of overheard radio, and whispered codes through the vents. The men learned that senators were talking about closing ADX Florence. For prisoners who had lost years to silence, it was like oxygen hitting a dying flame. Some laughed, calling it a fantasy. Others clung to it with desperation. One inmate scratched into his wall with a spoon. The walls will fall. For the first time in years, ADX wasn't just a tomb. It was a place humming with restless hope. Dreams of freedom, plans of violence. But hope in a place like ADX is dangerous. Some inmates began dreaming of transfer to less secure prisons, places where bribes, smuggled phones, and even escape could be possible. Others saw it differently. They believed the government would never let them out alive. For them, the only way forward was to strike before the fortress could tighten again. In one block, guards found a chilling message scrawled in soap across a mirror. If ADX falls, we rise in blood. The same fortress that once crushed men into silence was now vibrating with a dangerous energy, and the staff, already stretched thin, knew they were sitting on the edge of something that could either bring calm or unleash the deadliest chapter in ADX history. The hidden plot. For weeks, the prison seemed calm again. Guards carried on their routines, sliding food trays, counting heads, logging patrols. But behind the walls, something far more sinister was unfolding. The inmates weren't just whispering hope anymore. They were building a plan. Using the same vent taps, pipe knocks, and coded letters hidden in legal mail, they pieced together a network across different blocks. The goal wasn't just protest. It was power. One cartel boss promised money on the outside if a guard could be turned. A former gang leader spread messages through vents, rallying men to stand as one. Even isolated terrorists began signaling through pipes, creating an alliance that had never been seen before in Florence. To the guards, the silence felt normal. But to the prisoners, it was a silence of strategy. The quiet before the storm. The day of fire. Then, on a cold morning in Colorado, it began. A guard making his rounds smelled smoke. At first, he thought it was a wiring issue. But when he peered through a slot, he saw flames licking up the side of a mattress. Within minutes, alarms blared across the compound. Dozens of cells erupted in chaos. Inmates set fire to clothes, jammed locks with soap, and flooded their cells with overflowing toilets. The riot wasn't confined to one unit this time. It was coordinated. The Alcatraz of the Rockies shook with noise it had never heard before. Hundreds of prisoners, once thought broken, now roaring together. For a brief, terrifying moment, it looked like ADX Florence, the strongest prison in America, was about to fall from the inside. The crackdown. When the fires erupted, Florence turned into a war zone. Sirens wailed across the compound, and the prison went into code red. Black-clad emergency response teams stormed the blocks, shields raised, gas masks on. Tear gas canisters were fired through the food slots. The thick smoke filled the narrow cells, forcing prisoners to the ground coughing and gagging. Water cannons blasted down flames. The sound of boots pounded against the concrete as one cell after another was ripped open. One by one, inmates were shackled, dragged out, and thrown face first onto the floor. The so-called generals of the uprising, the cartel boss, the gang leader, and the suspected masterminds, were stripped, searched, and transferred into deep isolation pods, where every second of their existence would be watched. By dawn, the fires were out. The fortress was silent again. Officials proudly announced, control was never lost. But that was only the surface. The message in the ashes. As guards cleared the wreckage, they found something chilling burned into the soot-stained wall of one recreation cage. Florence does not break us. We break Florence. It was more than graffiti. It was a message to the outside world. Somehow, through chaos and fire, the prisoners had once again shown that even the most secure prison in America could be shaken. The fires were out. The doors were locked. The silence had returned. But every guard, every warden, every official knew the truth. Florence might still stand, but the myth of its unbreakable power had already cracked forever. And in those cracks, the men inside were still waiting, plotting, whispering, because inside ADX Florence, the real Alcatraz of the Rockies, silence is never the end. It's only the pause before the next storm. The real Alcatraz of the Rockies, ADX Florence, was built to be the end of the line. The government called it escape-proof, riot-proof, and chaos-proof, a place where America's most dangerous criminals would disappear into silence forever. And yet, behind those concrete walls, the truth is far more complicated. The fortress has seen weapons smuggled from nothing, riots sparked in silence, letters leaked into the world, and fires that threatened its very core. Some inmates crumbled, their minds swallowed by isolation. Others turned that silence into strategy, whispering through vents and pipes, keeping alive the belief that Florence could never fully cage them. To the outside world, it is the Alcatraz of the Rockies. But to the men inside, it is something darker, a slow war survival, where the strongest cling to their sanity and the weakest fade into madness. And the most haunting truth? Florence still stands. The fires are out, the cells are locked, the guards still march their rounds. But the cracks remain hidden, waiting, because inside ADX Florence, silence is never permanent. It's just a sound before the next storm. The fortress and the cracks. ADX Florence was meant to be perfect, the end of the line. A prison that could silence chaos, break rebellions, and erase the names of America's most dangerous men. But as we've seen, silence doesn't always mean control. Behind those steel doors, men sharpened metal into weapons, turned whispers into networks, and even lit fires that shook the Rockies. The government built a fortress to bury the unbreakable. Yet time and again, the cracks have shown. Some call it justice. Others call it cruelty. But one thing is certain. Florence is not just a prison. It's a battlefield where the strongest fight to hold on to their sanity and the weakest fall into the darkness of their own minds. And maybe that's the real truth about the Alcatraz of the Rockies. It was never just about locking men away. It was about testing the limits of human survival on both sides of the bars. So the question remains, will ADX Florence stand forever as America's most secure prison? Or will its silence someday give way to another storm?